So yeah, with that, we'll turn it over to Ethan, who is doing it on the Austin Area Sustainability Indicator. So a great segue from our previous conversation if you were here for that.
All right, I guess. Oh, the mic's on. Okay, we're ready to go. Let me just see if this is working. Okay. Hi, my name's Ethan Tenison. I am a data scientist and a project manager at the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Service, which is a research center within the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And today I'm going to talk to you all about the Austin Sustainability Indicators dashboard that was created in collaboration with a lot of organizations, but primarily with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability. And so originally, I will preface this by saying I created 7 slides, and I realized I was just lecturing. So I think what's going to be most impactful is if I go straight to the dashboard itself, and I'm going to use that as kind of like the medium of the presentation. So to give you all a little bit of a backstory, I think Patrick was helping me out there. About a year, a half ago, the city came to us with a project because Microsoft was giving them money to place industry standard air quality sensors throughout the city. The main problem, though, is that we were a little bit unsure what would be the best locations to place them. And so originally we were just looking at air quality data, particulate matter 2.5 and ozone, which are actually, it's not the highest quality data, which is why we want the sensors, right? But then we soon found out that there were many different data sources relating to environmental hazards, environmental quality that we could include in this dashboard so that it could be used by the Office of Sustainability to help them make effective policy, to push for different programs in the city. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the data itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the thought process that went in the design. One of the main considerations for this project is that the audience is stakeholders and also the general public. So we had to translate a lot of very academic information to a general audience. It was definitely a struggle. I should also just shout out to Dell Medical School and CapCog were 2 of our other collaborators on this project. So this is just the landing page that's meant to be, easily accessible and inviting. It includes a welcome guide that kind of gives people an introduction about what the purpose of this is, including links. All of the data sets were separated into topic areas. And so on the left, we have different tabs. I'm going to start with the environment variables. So we can see right away that we're looking at, I guess maybe it's a little bit hard to see. This is the average tree cover in the city of Austin based on census block groups. So we can see right away that there are some major disparities in the city just for tree cover. On the right, we're showing a comparison between how different demographic groups experience average tree cover, if you want to think about it. The red line represents the average for the region. So we've got the bar plot on the top, which just shows you the basic averages for groups. We see already that low income and Hispanic population have fewer trees. And below that, we see a box plot, which I actually had to really kind of fight to include because people don't like to remember high school, I don't think, and that they've seen box plots before. And so what we did was we added certain helper functions to help a general audience understand it. So we included things like a helper function right here. So this gives people a background on how to interpret the bar plot and the box plot. We also included helper buttons to give people more information about the variables that they're seeing. So here's a definitions list of all the variables that we included in this section, including data source and things like year. We wanted to create something that, how should I say this, wasn't too cluttered. A lot of the time when we're looking at academic studies, you see too much on the page at once. So we wanted to only show the most relevant information at a time, and that being average tree cover, but we also have tons of variables that you can flip through. So we got things like heat exposure, flood exposure. So these are all like relative risk of an extreme weather event, and I've been given the 2-minute mark, so I'm going to quickly skip over a lot of things and highlight one of our most important data sets that we received from Dell Medical School, which is asthma emergency room incidence rates. And so we can see that there's huge disparities in the city of Austin, with the Black community experiencing over 2 times the average asthma incidence rates. This is just within Travis County, I should say. So we can see right away that there are some areas that are overrepresented than others, and this could possibly be regions where we would want to place those air quality sensors. But this kind of is expanded just from using air quality sensors and to be used to help us decide where we're gonna start other programs as well. It also includes, probably have one more minute, we have a social vulnerability tab where we have an index of a lot of variables using principal component analysis and factor analysis. So this is like a composite index that includes things like income, median rent, demographic groups, some access to transportation. So it's just like a big snapshot at seeing where are the most vulnerable communities in Travis County. It also includes lots of information for people to find out more, and a really nice section to kind of give people a shout out who are part of this project. So 2 of those people are in this room right now, Mark and Patrick Bixler, who were incredible additions to the team. And I think that's about all the time I have. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and happy to answer any questions later.
This one? Yes. Oh, cool. All right. Is this on? Woo. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Pérez Quiñones, or Kathy. I think that's my name now, academic name. So I work with Frontline Community Partnerships for climate justice. I'm an RA, but I'm also a doctoral student in the community and regional program. So what we're going to present today, I will be presenting kind of like our development on a little bit of the literature review we've been doing for environmental justice work with youth. So just an overview of, like, super quick of our flagship project. Oh, next. This flagship project seeks to work with frontline communities to understand the environmental issues they confront as a way of developing more contextualized knowledge that better informs climate action strategies. Specifically, we wanted to work with youth and low-income communities through photo voice. So this is a participatory method that encourages people to build narratives around an issue and kind of explore their experience of that issue. And we all know participatory methods, kind of trendy, all of that, but we really have been taking the time to dive into the literature and understand, you know, what could be the drawbacks, or what things are working, what things are not working, especially with youth and lower income youth. So these are very, you know, particular populations that we need to be very careful in the ways we engage. And so participatory methods, if anyone hasn't heard of it yet, they seek to undo or redefine traditional dynamics of how we do research on communities, right? By instead working with them to design and implement a research project. Okay, so it's way more beyond community engagement. It's actually taking the time to go there and learn about the interest and develop a project. And the premise of youth participatory research is basically that young people are critical sources of knowledge, and that they know about their communities. They have a particular set of experiences, right, that we should engage with them. And it has been taking some, like, more and more scholarship has been kind of rooting for these methods, especially with youth. We wanted to see how well this is working again. And we have done an extensive search of White initiatives. Oops, I forgot to switch, I'm sorry. But for this one, I'm kind of presenting from 15 articles that we chose. They were empirical case studies of different projects. One of them was actually like a multi-sided initiative. And they looked at the intersection of YPAR and environmental issues in planning. And we have articles that are very heavy on quant and like gathering very quantitative data, and others are more qualitative, and the ways they analyze this data is also kind of a mixed methods. Some of them do more surveys and interviews than others. So I think I'm going to spend the rest of the time in this slide. I also prepared 7 slides, but I think this is going to be kind of where I land. So these studies vary a lot between them and their approach and the number of youth they engage. And the way they do it, they reflect many disciplines, from a lot of public health, a lot of medicine schools, but also sociologists, anthropologists, like I said, also more planning scholars as well. But there seems to be a pattern among the modalities of the YPAR and how the YPAR is conducted, and also a relation with the results. So these first two, I'm sorry it's not visually like striking at all. The first two are examples that take youth as data sources. So the main source of data is the youth. So they will examine their experiences, their beliefs, their perceptions around an issue, an environmental issue, or also their understanding, lead exposure, climate change. So this approach seems to involve youth the least from what we could see from these cases. In terms of the type of questions it tries to answer, often researchers come with a somewhat fixed idea of what they want to look at. And many of them integrate youth advisory boards to co-create some questions that the youth might want to answer themselves. It's heavy on interviews, but usually gravitates towards this extractive practice that we were talking about before. And also due to time and funding constraints, many lack in implementing the actual action part of the youth participatory action research. In the middle, we have some that are more aligned with our own research project, which is kind of understanding the relation between youth and their environment. These are maybe like lower tech kind of projects compared to the other one, which are way more applied. And a common practice is having them identify the issues in their neighborhoods, gathering data, and have them prepare the reports, present them to the communities. This way, hopefully, they can change a couple of policies, whether it's in their school or hopefully also like in citywide policy. And lastly, we have this approach, which is, I think from what we've been seeing, is the more resource, the one that consumes the more resource. Like we need much more labor, we need much more training for teachers to get involved, for community organizations to get involved in the training, because it's a lot of citizen science involves, youth learning about a software, learning about a particular tool, right, to gather data of air quality, pollution. Sometimes it can be very extractive as well, and I know it's my time, I'm sorry. But also it's very applied in the sense that some of them give youth a very tangible area to work in, like food systems is a very huge one in these youth projects. But wrapping up, in terms of results or social change, the second and third group get closer to developing agendas, but very few get to the action component in a structural sense. And the last one, as I said, just consumes a lot of resource, which goes back to the question of our limitations as scholars and researchers, and we have like particular timelines, and they don't match up with the youth's timeline. So yeah, there are many things we are learning from this. Stronger community partnerships are always better. I will stop there, I guess. Didn't time myself off. Yeah, wow.
One more, yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you today. I'm Keri Stevens, and I'm a mixed method social science researcher. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is one of my projects having to do with flooding and the state of Texas. I have a number of these studies going on. This one was funded by the Texas Water Development Board. They were fantastic collaborators. They helped us do our sampling protocol. And if you happen to be here at the poster session, you may have seen my wonderful collaborators. Kendall Titch talked about our wildfire drill, which just won a UT Tower Award, where we collaborated with a community in Travis County to run a wildfire evacuation drill, super fun. And Nancy Carlson talked about our Planet 2050 project, where we're working with the Climate Navigators program. And Cassidy is also doing some wonderful work related to health and environment. So let me dive in and share with you, we all probably know by now, floods are the most frequent and costly disaster that we have. One of the big challenges we have, I think, that people aren't talking enough about, is that the flood maps have changed. A lot more people are going to be paying higher premiums if they haven't heard already that they are. And we haven't provided people with the tools to be able to go out and communicate these drastic changes that are about to happen. So in this particular study, we used one model, which is called a PRISM model, which has to do with what's driving people to seek flood information. Because what we do know is that people aren't getting a whole lot from mass media and places like that. So our goal is to understand what encourages people to seek this information. So I'll just kind of quickly go through. If anybody's interested, this paper's under review, but I don't mind at all sharing an earlier version of it. We oversampled people in the state of Texas who were in flood-prone areas. We used a pretty complex algorithm to make that decision. Texas Water Development Board helped us with that decision making. We were looking at a lot of different outcomes, and we were really looking at what's driving how people are looking for information. So a couple of key things that we found. Essentially, our overall model worked really well. We did a structural equation model. I'm going to click by it really fast here in a minute because not a lot of people really enjoy seeing structural equation models, but if you want to see it, it's in the paper. I'll be glad to share it. But let's take a look at the overall model. Performed pretty well in helping us understand why people are seeking flood risk information. We also performed pretty well in terms of people's flood risk perception. And there's a couple of key things we did in this paper, and one of them is that we took a look specifically at people who were living in flood-prone areas, because we would assume they would have more mass media communication about flooding than people who didn't live in flood-prone areas. And when I say areas, I mean zip codes, because we did them based on zip codes in here. And so if we take a look, we'll go really fast past our structural equation model, and let me just talk through what the key findings are. So first of all, what we found is the expectations of other people. If other people are talking about flood information, you're a lot more likely to seek flood information. So what I think this really is very important for those of us who are interested in community engaged approaches is I have a line of research right now that would suggest that we actually need to be using the community to distribute our messages, even possibly more than mass media messages, because that's who people trust. And we have a lot of issues with misinformation floating around. You're going to do something if someone you know and trust says that they do it as well. The other thing we found, unfortunately, is the people who are more likely to seek are the ones who already know a lot because they want to know more. And so we've got to find better ways to reach those people who don't know as much about flood information. The other thing we did in here, there's a new model of risk perception, which is a 3-construct measure that looks specifically at your probability that you think a flood might happen or a risk of any type might happen, the severity, and then also how you feel about it, your affect. And we incorporated that into the model, and we found that that was very important to do. First time people have done that. And the reason is that those different constructs work differently in the model. And so we think moving forward, that's something people really need to do. Living in a flood-prone area isn't enough. We looked everywhere. We could not find a single difference between people living in flood-prone areas in terms of how they seek flood information, except the next one. All right? If you've had experience before, well, you know to seek it, right? And I think that we can take these findings and apply them to a lot of different types of disasters that we study today. We can think about the way we're dealing with fires right now. Most people are not prepared for fires, even though we did a simulation model a few years back and showed, probably not surprising to most people, if you live in this little center of Austin, you're not going to be able to get out if we have a fast-moving fire coming from the south. So I think that there are a lot of really important things that we need to be focused on, and one of them is, how are we going to get people informed about kind of the changing nature of risk and with climate change? So thank you from all our team. We've had a lot of fun doing this project. We'll be presenting it, the full paper we'll be presenting in Paris, which is my first time to travel since pandemic started, at the end of May. And we're excited we're on the top panel of the Environmental Communication Division at that conference. So look forward to chatting with people about some of our fun work.
All right, so apologies. I'm actually an undergraduate student, so I don't know how I finagled my way here. But my presentation is not going to be as intelligent or well-spoken as everyone else's. But my presentation is going to be a really boiled-down version of my thesis project, which is called Saving Our Soil. And it's to develop this idea of soil stewardship, especially amid changing climate conditions. There's going to be a lot on these slides. I can't do it all in 7 minutes, but I'll try my best. So the idea for starting this project was I come from an agricultural background, and I kind of wanted to, figure out how to mend like my environmentalist interests with my agricultural background. And then, of course, climate change was a huge part of it, too. And so I worked with Dr. Timothy Beach as well as Dr. Bixler, who's here today. And the idea was to stop the constant finger wagging at agriculturalists. I wanted to not do a problem identification. I wanted to work off the basis that there are so many problems we already know about, but soil is one that we're not really looking at. And so I wanted to talk about this idea of stewardship. And so, we can't be a master of our natural resources as much as we may try. So whether it comes to water, atmosphere, soil, or other key resources, the idea is to change our approach and to shift. Instead of evolving to a species that tries to master all of our resources, instead shift our perspective on our natural resources towards one of stewardship, where we acknowledge that nature is the master and that Earth is the master, and that at the end of the day, we're just trying to form a working relationship. A big part of this project is the idea of, the carbon cycle. Plants are the biggest players, one of the biggest players in this carbon cycle, and agriculture is a huge way for us to change our relationship with the atmosphere and with the carbon cycle. So what I found is that regenerative agriculture is something we want to move towards. The idea behind regenerative agriculture is essentially everything that organics is and more. So it's not only not using huge amounts of pesticides, herbicides, unnatural and artificial fertilizers, but also trying to basically steward this layer of topsoil that is so integral to our environment and our health. One of the big things is that, modern industrial agriculture overuses something called a moldboard plow, which basically takes the ground, upheaves everything from underneath the soil, brings it to the top, and everything else shuffles down. And the issue with that approach is that there's so many of these various forms of life that thrive in that environment inside of the topsoil that are so key to the growth of plants and to the carbon cycle. And when you pull all of those organisms up out of the ground and expose them to the sun and the wind and the rain, you spell basically disaster for your soil over the long term. And so there's so many different ways that regenerative agriculture seeks to increase those various organic factors and restore that relationship between the soil and the plants and the atmosphere. So what exactly does this look like? It's defined by a series of approaches called conservation tillage. No-till is kind of the biggest one that I want to talk about in my project, but there's of course all these other kind of supporting pieces of this puzzle. And the idea is that if we build up our topsoil layers and we instead of continuously taking from the soil in the form of crops and then having to basically dump fertilizers and biocides and everything else onto the soil, instead if we invest with each crop into the soil with nitrogen fixing crops, green manures, and those other kinds of resources, that the soil is going to return to us better qualities in terms of more erosion resistance. There's going to be less runoff. There's going to be less of those forces of soil erosion that can basically spell disaster for a lot of farmers. And so these are all different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to regenerative agriculture. And then I guess what I'm really trying to contribute to this is my specialty in government and talk about how different levels different levels of policymaking can influence this process and push us towards a better outcome in terms of agriculture and promoting regenerative agriculture. So that goes all the way from groups that are working on an international and global scale down to the farmers and consumers. And one of the ones I want to talk about is the idea of higher consumer scrutiny. So having, organics and beyond. So instead of seeing organics and those kind of products as a kind of high-end consumer product, instead we need to be shifting our focus and shifting our lifestyles and our purchasing habits to believe that instead regenerative agriculture should be the key, or we should be looking at the way our products and produce are grown. Another part of that is more farmers at smaller scale. Local products are always going to be grown more sustainably than products that are going to be shipped all over the nation and all over the world. So the idea is that if we push more of our money towards these smaller farmers working at smaller scale, they can put more of these regenerative agriculture techniques at work and increase the sustainability overall of our products. And then also Farm Bill reform is a big part of it because of the fact that in the United States, we're heavily subsidizing the growth of corn and soybeans to the detriment of our soil a lot of the time. And then also the federal crop insurance program. A very simple fix would be a rulemaking change that would essentially add a clause to the federal crop insurance program that says if a farmer wants to insure their crops, they need to take steps to increase the sustainability of their soil long term. So, and that's a huge piece of the puzzle because so many large industrial farmers would not be able to afford what they do without the federal crop insurance program. But at the same time, the way that they're working now is getting the crop insurance, and then it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if they use these, whether they're in the long term decreasing their soil value and everything else. So yeah, that's my project. So thank you guys so much for listening.
Hi, everybody. I'm Derek Haas from the Mechanical Engineering Department, and I'm going to talk today about building a molten salt reactor by 2025. So why do we want to do this? Well, we want to solve the world's energy, medicine, and water problems, so we're starting small. But realistically, we do need to take small steps in order to get to solutions for these big problems. So we're taking one technological solution. We're going to try to walk it through growth to the point that it can actually help solve some of these things. So energy, straightforward with a nuclear reactor. You're going to produce electricity. Medicine is one that people don't normally think of, but a significant number of medical procedures are performed every year using radioactive substances made in nuclear reactors. These nuclear reactors that we're trying to build will make those easier to get and more available around the world. And last, water. Nuclear reactors are excellent at desalinating water. So they have high heat output, it's very reliable, it's on all the time, and if you don't need some of the electricity that it's producing, instead of ramping down the power of the reactor, you just divert the heat to making fresh water instead of turning the reactor off. The reactor actually prefers to stay running at full power all the time. So why molten salt? This is different than today's reactors. Today's reactors are light water reactors with solid fuel. In a molten salt reactor, the fuel is liquid, the uranium is suspended in it, and you run that through a reactor so that it produces the energy. Molten salt reactors are safe, and I'll say that most of the time in general audiences, the question about nuclear energy is, but what about the safety? And outside of this project, my answer is nuclear power is already the safest form of energy we have. That's just facts. So this is even safer. It does away with some of the high pressures that you deal with in a light water reactor. And so if there was an accident here, the fuel drains out of the container, it spills on the floor, it's messy and it's hard to clean up, but it doesn't get released to the environment. Next, it is clean, so no CO2 emissions, no particulate emissions. It's efficient, it's higher temperature so that it's even more efficient than today's nuclear reactors and even coal power plants. It's multifunctional, as I mentioned, to produce things like fresh water. It can also be used in hydrogen production, medical isotopes. It's very scalable, so it's not reliant on supply chains that can be disrupted very easily. I mentioned carbon-free and reliable. Nuclear reactors tend to stay running even through environmental changes and disasters. So how are we doing this? We have a collaboration between University of Texas, Texas A&M, Georgia Tech, and then the center of the work is being done at Abilene Christian University. We're funded by Natura Resources, a private company that has funded the project at $30 million over 2.5 years. UT gets about $3.5 million of that to do our part of the work, and we are moving forward. So we have over 150 faculty, staff, and students participating in the development of this. This is not a paper reactor, is the way it's called in our profession. There's a hole in the ground in Abilene right now where we're going to pour concrete. We're going to build this thing. So this is the architectural design of the building. This is right next to campus. It's actually going to be absorbed into the campus as soon as it's completed. We have a big trench in the ground, and you basically build your reactor and then you drop it in there. And I talked earlier about getting small bites on our way to solving these big problems. Well, going straight into having a giant power producing reactor has not worked very well over the last 30 years in nuclear power. So our plan is to design and build a research reactor, just like the one we have at UT. We have a 1 megawatt research reactor here. This will be about a 1 megawatt reactor that will sit down in this trench. It won't produce any electricity, but it should provide us a path to being licensed to operate sooner than if we were going for the big reactor. And then we get a lot of the data that helps to scale up. So when we were good at nuclear power in the United States, it was because we built things, we found out what broke, we fixed that, and we iterated. Now we try to go all the way to the perfect solution because we can't accept any risk. Well, if you scale down the size of the project, you minimize the risk significantly. So we're going to be moving forward with building that, hopefully turning it on in 2025, and then help with moving forward to commercialization. We do have support of the state of Texas. We have resolution from the state Senate and House, as well as feedback from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We've started engagements there, and we're working with the Department of Energy to get our uranium. It's not something you can just go buy. So why am I here? Mainly because I want to just tell the university that we're doing this and ask if anybody has ideas to help. We heard earlier in the panel that Austin has nuclear power as part of our energy source. There's no real interest in growing that to have more power, and I think that's a bad idea. I think we need to communicate better. I'm an engineer. I'm not overly good at communicating with people. I throw stats and graphs and box and whisker charts. Way to go! I'm interested in understanding priorities of the specific communities. So we're working with a group in Africa to help to try to design a plant around their needs. And we thought it would be electricity. They said, no, we need the isotopes first. So things like that. Communicating the risks and benefits, again, something the nuclear industry is terrible at. But we have a great story to tell. We just need help with that. And then investigating the specifics of hydrogen production and desalination. So we know how neutrons work. We know how corrosion works. We're not experts at desalination or hydrogen production. So with that, thanks for having me. Talk to you later.
This off. All right. Hi, my name is Richelle Crotty. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Technology and Information Policy Institute here at Moody College of Communication, of which Keri Stevens is co-director. This research project examines the role that libraries play in their communities in times of disaster. This project was funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services and was spearheaded by Dr. Sharon Strover here at UT and Dr. Marcia Martis at Florida State University. We had 3 research questions. So how do small and rural libraries respond to disaster events, and how do they interact with their community members? How do libraries use information and communication technologies during and after disasters to interact with their organizations and institutions that are also assisting their communities? And what institutional practices contribute to their resiliency during and after disasters, even as they help their communities? So in particular, we asked in 2019 over 50 librarians to reflect on their experiences with Hurricane Michael in Florida and Hurricane Harvey in Texas. Hurricane Michael was record-setting in terms of wind damage, and it was a Category 5 hurricane. It was really catastrophic to the region. Some of you might be more familiar with Hurricane Harvey, that the flooding damage was incredibly extensive, and even today there are still people who are displaced from their homes as a result of Harvey. In 2020 and 2021, we followed up with the same librarians in Texas about how they responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Although these disasters are very, very different, right? Hurricanes tend to have some kind of forewarning, so a preparation phase, the disaster phase, and the recovery phase. COVID-19 was nothing like that, as we all have lived and experienced it together. But we did find out some things about resiliency across these 2 disasters for our librarians. In particular, the physical space of the library was crucial to local community resiliency. The #1 most used resource that the library provided during times of disaster was its meeting room. If you're not familiar, libraries, for the most part, have meeting rooms that anybody who is a library patron or member of the community can walk in and request to use. After Hurricane Harvey and Michael in Florida and Texas, FEMA used these library rooms, the Red Cross used these rooms to meet with individuals and local organizations to help the community recover. For COVID-19, the rooms were closed, obviously, and you couldn't actually go to your library for quite a while. They moved to doing curbside service and providing expanded digital resources, but the meeting rooms was one of the most missed resources at the library. People would call and say, hey, when can I request space, over and over again. Librarians were quite tired of answering that question, actually. Our second finding about resiliency was that librarians as skilled information professionals is really crucial, because when you don't know what to do in the event of a disaster and you don't have electricity at home and you don't have internet access at home, whether it's because you can't afford it or it's not there or the disaster caused limited access, you go to the library for help. This is consistent from the hurricanes and during COVID-19. People didn't know what to do when they couldn't enter their home because of damage. They didn't know where to go, so they went to the libraries. And librarians providing these skills were really crucial to helping their communities recover. For organizational resiliency, this one's a little bit interesting because for all of our Florida libraries and for one county in Texas, they had county-wide systems for their libraries. So this meant that there was an organization that helped with decision-making for all of their libraries within their system. Libraries that did not have this type of county-wide organizational system reported more confusion, more discomfort, lack of resources in order to respond to hurricanes and the pandemic. So this was a really crucial way for libraries with county systems to get a seat at the table for disaster planning and mitigation. Fourth, we had strength of relationships to other libraries. Librarians that reported strong informal and formal networks. So a formal network would be the case of the county system. An informal system would be, some of them referred to as their sister libraries, where basically their best friend was also the library director at another library, and often they were close by. And these relationships really helped them feel more prepared to deal with disasters for their community. And lastly, number 5 is split off, because we only found this during the hurricane recovery phase that librarians were repurposed for recovery. So librarians were hosting food drives, they were clearing debris from the streets, they were clearing flooding, hosting clothing drives. Really, librarians are doing it all to help their communities, especially in times of disasters, but really all of the time as well. But we didn't find quite the same repurposing of librarians after COVID-19. And in fact, some of our librarians expressed a lot of frustration with not knowing what their role could have been to help their communities respond. There wasn't a place in disaster planning of novel disasters to incorporate librarians. And so one thing that we've heard across all of our interviews is that this is a way of life, dealing with disasters, overlapping, simultaneous disasters, because during the COVID-19 pandemic, librarians in Texas in particular had hurricanes, they had flooding, they had wildfires, there was a chemical plant that exploded next to a library and literally blew a wall off. They have pipe damage from plumbing issues. Really, it's constant. And so some of the ways that we've found that we could recommend to librarians is to aid in even more resiliency for their communities in the face of disaster is to improve how they communicate over social media. Particularly for the COVID-19 pandemic, librarians wish that they had communicated more about the virus itself rather than just pointing people to the CDC. They had a kind of a missed opportunity to digest that information for their community. Also, integration with local government and disaster planning is really needed, especially for librarians that libraries that are not part of these county-wide systems. They need disaster training. They're already doing this work without a lot of formal disaster training. Librarians that had disaster training sought that out either in personal past experiences or because they actually played more than one role in their community's local government. Lastly, mental health support for librarians is crucial. They're experiencing burnout, caregiver fatigue. They can't access mental health resources during a disaster. just like anybody who has a psychiatry appointment and the office is closed for flooding, right? But at the same time, these people are giving this type of care to their patrons, and we need to be able to support them while they do that. And that's pretty much it.
Oh, that would be really helpful. I'll click for you.
This is it's fun to do this as a team. All right. See if I can get myself clicked in. So I never understood why people put candidate. I was like, what's the big deal? But I just did my comps and I understand why people make a big deal. So it's like, yeah. I was like, I don't understand what the title means. And they're like, now I do. Now I do. Yeah. Hi, I'm Nichole. I'm a PhD candidate in the Moody School for Communication. I study science communication. But I often hang out in the theater department with
Dossett.
Lara.
Nice to see y'all. Happy to be here.
Yeah. And so I'm going to be talking about we're part of the Stories of Ancient Resilience group. And we in particular are interested in the ways that young people perform their research on environmental justice. I get to skip my next part because Kathy gave us a really great introduction. And I'll just say, we're interested particularly in youth participatory action research in the ways that it centers their lived experience and the ways that we can position them as leaders in both the research and the performance process. I see my role as like, I bring the toy box and then they tell us where we're gonna go. Yeah, and I'll do the first part of this. I'll talk about a couple of the iterations we've had, and then I'll pass it over to Lara, who is going to tell us the very near future iterations. So we've been really lucky to partner with a lot of different groups over, special thanks to Texas State, El Ranchito, Keeling Middle School, but I'm gonna focus today on a long-term partnership and relationship that we have with Austin Youth River Watch. They're a group in town that mostly serves BIPOC high schoolers, and they're really interested in teaching restorative ecology. And so we've been lucky enough to be embedded in their programming, both virtually and trying to figure out what that is, and then during that lovely period of summer 2021 when we could gather in person outdoors. And so we've started to develop a model for this, where the invitation to young people is, what are these mainstream environmental messages that we get? What are we being told we should do to protect the environment? And so they gathered all these stories about plastic straws and recycling and all the things we've been told we should do. And then they brought forth critiques of those, of which of these are blaming us as individuals, which of these are excluding some people and leaving people behind, which of these are invoking fear and shame. And in response to these stories, they developed their own counter-narratives. So the toy box that I brought was, I taught them interview techniques, and we also learned Yaso's community cultural wealth to think about the ways that our communities already contain the capacities. Either they were already doing this, or we could imagine that they could steward the environment. And so young people went off to experts of their choosing, did interviews. We all gathered around, and I taught them how we look for themes in interviews. And then they activated these interviews through an immersive outdoor performance. And so that's the kind of model that we have developed. We had a lot of time making meaning of of environmental change, and then thinking about these counter narratives and what does that mean for what we might do in our communities. Yeah, we'll do. And I'll next talk about some of the themes that came up. And don't worry, I will read this to you. One of the big things that came up was an enhanced sense of agency. We were particularly interested in this, so we asked them, kind of what were the ways in which they did or didn't feel these things. And they speak way better than I do, so I'll read some of their quotes. So participant 1 says, I would say my confidence definitely went up because I always wanted to talk, but I didn't know who would listen. So now that I know that people are willing to listen, and to me, when I talk as a teenager, it does increase my confidence. And then participant 2 brings in some especially beautiful metaphors. So my favorite part of the process was I actually did notice I was building confidence. I had to practice driving with my driving instructor the other day, and I was always scared of driving, relatable, because I was always afraid of somebody who was going to cut me off. And it was going to be like an older person. I would just let them go by. And eventually, I got to that point where I was like, you know what? I'm also driving on this road too. I can also take charge if I wanted to, because I follow the same laws as you do. So I feel like that's really helped me in my life experience too. And so what we can see from these brilliant young people is that this stepping into the role of a performer and having a platform for performance really helped them feel like they were being listened to about how they relate to and how they perceive climate change. And we're really interested in continuing to look at, like, what does this platform of performance do for agency? And I'll talk to one more theme before we get to hear about exciting new directions. And that is embodiment came up as a really surprising issue. When we were dealing with interview data, we found lots of flexibility, lots of the resilience that we're looking for. But as soon as we got back into our bodies with the performance, and we didn't have a lot of time to be embodied. We were high schoolers coming out of COVID and Zoom times, but we reverted back to a lot of doomsday scenarios. So we have our climate fiction mad scientist here. And so we were just noticing that we're very curious about future work, really spending way more time with the body, as that has a long intergenerational memory for trauma and fear. And we really didn't spend enough time there. And we think that there's something really interesting happening there that we might create more space in a container for. And now I'll pass it over to Lara.
Yeah, so this semester particularly, we have moved this project also into a space that can accommodate a school context. So this has been outside of school, and now we're moving it into a school context. This semester, this project, this iteration, is in conversation and in partnership with Drama for Schools, which is an organization embedded within the theater and dance department. We specifically look at arts integration with schools, school districts, thinking about shifting the learning culture through the arts. All right, specifically focusing on equity and justice. We work with something called arts integration, which means you are learning within an art form and showing, demonstrating your understanding through the arts. This year, right now, today, I was with a 5th grade class where we are doing a small pilot that is a different iteration of the work that Nichole's talking about and that their team did amazing work on, thinking a lot about water and access to water as one entry point to climate change and climate justice. So the young people are reflecting on what they know about water and the future of water, what stories they've been told, and also have the opportunity to learn about some Mayan water management tools, and thinking specifically about how does everyone in a community have water. The exciting thing is we're going to be moving into the future in fall 2022. The goal of this is to expand it into a full pilot in a high school, utilizing youth participatory action research, where students will act as researchers, teachers, learners, and also agents of change, where they will experience the curriculum, help us revise it, and then teach it to younger students. So we're super excited for this opportunity as an outlet for young people to share what they know and they feel about climate change and how they can be active agents of change in that within their school communities. Thanks.